Welcome to Carpal Tunnel Syndrome. It's not all in the wrist. My name is Bill, and on behalf of Posturing for Health, I welcome thee. Carpal Tunnel Syndrome is a common problem. It can affect people that work in offices and are on the keyboards a lot. It can also affect people in the trades. Myself, I used to be a cabinet maker and a carpenter, and you can get carpal tunnel syndrome from wood carving and things like that. Musicians, guitarists, keyboard players, a lot of these folks are subject to it. So the purpose of this talk is to identify the 4 key areas that can affect carpal tunnel and some self-massage techniques and things you can do on your own to, if not prevent it, at least manage it if you have it. The goal is always to avoid surgery and to get off the pharmaceuticals. So that's what this is about. All right, let's talk about what the carpal tunnel is. The carpal tunnel is a pathway that's in your wrist that allows the tendons, the arteries, the veins, and the nerves to travel through the wrist and out to the thumb and the fingers. Remember that a tendon is where a muscle attaches to a bone, okay? Different than a ligament. A ligament is where bone attaches to bone. A tendon is where the muscle attaches to the bone. Arteries are the source of blood and oxygen to the tissues, pumped by the heart. Veins are the return system, along with the lymphatic system. And nerves, there are lots of different types of nerves. There's proprioceptors that tell you where you are in space. There's pain nerves called nociceptors that tell you if you've damaged tissue. A lot of nerves that activate muscles and tell them to contract. So nerves, there's a whole variety of them, but they're all running through that carpal tunnel. The area, because it's the wrist, is very flexible, and therefore it's subject to injury. Wherever you have an area that is very flexible, like the shoulder or the wrist, to allow for all the movement means that there's less protection for the area. Another good example would be the neck. Okay, probably the most vulnerable place of our body and arguably the most flexible. If there's damage to the carpal tunnel, in other words, if there's any kind of inflammation or constriction that's impeding the signals or the movement of all the structures that have to pass through that little pathway, it will result in a loss of grip strength. You may get numbness or tingling down in the thumb and the fingers. The area that gets particularly singled out as being the problem is called the transverse carpal ligament. If you look on the left side of this picture, you see where the word ligament, and it goes to that little line, and it's a little gray area. It looks like a little piece of duct tape. Well, that is the transverse carpal ligament. And it's that ligament that, in a sense, forms or finalizes the carpal tunnel. If you look at the picture on the right, the little the whole area, the tunnel itself, carpal tunnel, where the median nerve goes through. Well, if you look above that, you would see where the ligaments attach from the top 2 bones and kind of finish it an upside down U shape. That's the carpal tunnel. And that ligament, the transverse carpal ligament, is a very important ligament. But oftentimes it's the one that gets blamed for carpal tunnel syndrome, and yet it's not the ligament at all. If you've been diagnosed with carpal tunnel syndrome, you'll be told to wear braces. You'll probably get some steroid shots. Eventually they'll talk about surgery, and the surgery will be cutting or releasing the transverse carpal ligament. The purpose of this talk is to help you avoid that. Now, before we go any further, let me tell you where I'm coming from as a body worker. I used to be a cabinet maker and construction, go in your home and fix up your house guy. And one thing that I've learned is that the problem isn't always where it shows up. I would get oftentimes called to a house because there was a leak in the ceiling. And when I would go up on the roof to find out where the water was getting in, it may be on the opposite side of the house. So I would have to explain to the homeowners that there was a problem with their chimney. And they're looking at me kind of strange, like, well, why are you working on the chimney when the problem is on the other side of the house? So I would have to explain to them that the problem isn't always where it shows up. The water's getting in around the flashing around the chimney, and then it's going down the rafter and then hitting the plate and traveling the plate and then coming back along the floor ceiling joist and dropping down through the ceiling and so on. Well, that principle in carpentry and in construction and problem solving, that the problem isn't always where it shows up, is no less true in the area of bodywork. In bodywork, it is not uncommon to have an ache or a pain in one area, but what's causing the ache and the pain is coming from an entirely different location. And that's what we're going to be looking at today, are 4 areas, some of them closer in proximity to the carpal tunnel, but some of them is very far away. And areas where you wouldn't think to look in solving carpal tunnel syndrome. So these 4 areas involved in carpal tunnel syndrome are the places that we want to investigate before we just jump into surgery, and even before we consent to steroid injections and stuff like this. Let's at least investigate these 4 areas that are involved with carpal tunnel syndrome. The first area is the wrist and the finger flexors. By flexors, I mean when the hand curls up like that. Okay. Now you'll notice the muscles in the forearm. We're going to be looking at those. They're the flexors. Then you'll notice these tendons here. One of them attaches right at the transverse carpal ligament, which allows your wrist to flex. The others travel through or travel under the transverse carpal ligament, and that's the carpal tunnel right there. And it's not just tendons that travel through there. Remember, there's arteries, there's veins, there's nerves. So that is a very important pathway. So we want to look at the flexors. The second area that we're going to look at are the extensors. They work opposite of the flexors. They bring the fingers back. If you notice, the extensor muscles have tendons that travel down through this, it looks like a piece of duct tape wrapped around the wrist. And that is called the flexor retinaculum. You don't have to know it for the test, but it's a very important area to be able to work on. Because if that band of ligament gets loaded up with scar tissue, it can grab a hold of the tendons and the other structures. Or if it is inflamed, if it gets injured like ligaments do, it will also put compression on that carpal tunnel pathway. So we want to look at the extensors. We also want to look at that ligament. The third area that we're going to look at has to do with the thumb. The muscles of the thumb are called the pollicis group. And again, you don't have to know all of them to be able to work on them. If you notice the thumb muscle here, the way it contracts the thumb, pulls it in, and also the pinky muscle, but mainly we're going to be looking at the thumb. It attaches at that transverse carpal ligament. So if there's a problem with that thumb muscle, it's going to affect the carpal tunnel. That is the ligament that is constantly getting blamed for carpal tunnel syndrome, but it's more of a victim than a culprit. That's why, and we'll stop for a second here with the problem areas, but the surgical approach is, there's something wrong with the wrist. Let's cut the ligament. And again, the purpose of this workshop is to maybe give you some options and things to explore before a drastic measure like that is necessary. Hopefully it's not necessary at all and you can avoid it. Okay, the fourth area is way up on the other side of the house, the scalene or the neck muscles, side of the neck, and the thoracic outlet. Here you see these nerves run down the neck under the collarbone, over the ribs, and through the carpal tunnel. That's an important pathway because if these muscles on the side of the neck get tight, the scalene muscles, they attach at the first and second rib. They'll pull the rib up closer to the collarbone and pinch off that plexus of nerves that runs under the collarbone and over the ribs. So the muscles on the side of the neck are an important area to explore when investigating carpal tunnel syndrome. Very quick review. The 4 areas that we need to explore and to maintain are the extensors, the flexors, the thumb muscles, and the scalenes. And this is a better look at the scalenes. You can see the posterior, middle, and anterior scalene muscles on either side of the neck. They run down and attach at the first and second ribs. And if you look at the picture on the right, you can see the arteries, the nerves, everything that runs under that collarbone, the clavicle, and over the top 2 ribs and then down the arm. So if those ribs get too close to the collarbone, it kind of puts compression on all those pathways, all those structures. That's what's called thoracic outlet syndrome. And it can show up as a problem in the carpal tunnel area. Okay, well, now that we know where to look, the big question is, what are we looking for? We're looking for 3 areas that can, or 3 disease states that will affect a muscle and muscle tissue. The first are called trigger points. Everyone's heard about trigger points. Well, what are they? Trigger points are a taut band of muscle fibers within the muscle. Okay? Muscles are made up of all these little filaments or all these little fibers, and the fibers are made up of things called sarcomeres. And a sarcomere is little teeny filaments of myosin and actin fibers. And they contract, and when they contract, they get shorter. So when you have thousands of these things set on end, and they all contract at once, the entire muscle contracts. If some of those sarcomeres lock shut and don't open back up again, that's called a trigger point. So maybe 90, 95, 98% of the muscle is relaxed and open, but 2% or 5% or more of the filaments are locked shut. It's going to put tension at the end of the attachment site. The muscle will be prone to tear, and you will also end up with problems down at the tendon. The trigger point will cause pulling and tearing at the attachment site of the muscle. The tearing will produce inflammation as well as scar tissue. That's the second area that we're looking at, scar tissue. Scar tissue is when the body sends collagen fiber to repair a tear. Whether it's in a muscle, in a tendon, in a ligament, the scar tissue is there to glue the tissue back together again. If you get too much of it, and depending on how it lays itself down, you can end up with a repair that restricts your range of motion and that can attach itself to nearby structures that will cause additional pain. Every time you move, other stuff is getting yanked on. So scar tissue isn't really the problem. It's the way the scar tissue lays down, and it's how much of it there is that becomes a problem. So we're going to be looking at scar tissue as well as trigger points. The third thing that we're going to be looking for are shortened muscles. A shortened muscle is not a muscle that just has trigger points in it that's making it shorter. A shortened muscle is a muscle that's actually grown itself shorter over time. I know that sounds weird because we think muscles are fixed items and they're just their length is their length. But not true. The muscle is a living, growing, breathing, changing organism. So if you are constantly placing your muscles in a certain form or position, they will grow to that form. What that means is, let's say you're always in a seated position, like this individual here. Look down at the bottoms of his legs there, where it says shortened hamstrings. If you're always in that position, sitting, the hamstrings don't need to be as long as when you're standing. And the body is very efficient. And so what it starts doing is casting off sarcomeres to make the muscle shorter so that that becomes the neutral position. Well, if that's the case, what do you think happens when you stand up? What ought to be a neutral position now becomes a stretch. So muscles can grow themselves shorter, and when they do, they put additional strain at the attachment sites, at the tendons. Okay? The front of this person, because they're hunched over, they're going to have shortened pectoralis muscles. The shoulders are in. Okay? Their entire abdominal muscle group is going to go into a shortened position. It's not going to feel natural for that person to stand up straight because their muscles have grown themselves shorter. Likewise, and we'll just touch on this, the opposing muscles, let's say along the back and the quadriceps along the tops of the legs, they're going to grow themselves longer because that's the position that they're mostly in. And once you grow muscles shorter and longer, you end up in a more permanent posture than you want to be in. All right, enough about that. We've talked about the 4 areas that we're looking for, okay, the flexors, the extensors, the thumb, and the scalenes. And we've talked about the 3 things that we're looking for. Trigger points in the muscle. We're looking for scar tissue buildup in the muscle or in the tendons or in the ligaments. And we're looking for shortened muscle groups that are putting unnecessary strain, in this case, on the transverse carpal ligament, or on the tendons of the flexors and the extensors, also on the first and second ribs. Moving on, what do we do when we find these things? I'm going to be teaching you a technique. It's called soft tissue release. It's also known as active tissue release in sports medicine. Also known as pin and stretch by physical therapists, but it's all the same thing. It was all started out as soft tissue release by a guy named Stuart Tawes, and he developed this technique of working on muscles that was kind of a one-stop shop of opening up trigger points, breaking down, realigning scar tissue, and lengthening muscles. So it's extremely helpful to learn this technique. It's a very simple technique to learn, and you don't have to be a trained bodywork professional to be able to do this for yourself or friends and family and give them some benefit. The steps of soft tissue release, very simple. Step 1, you're going to contract the muscle. You're going to put it in a shortened position. Step 2, you're going to place pressure on the muscle while it's in that shortened position. And then step 3, you're going to stretch the muscle or open it up under the pressure. And then you'll release the pressure and you'll go back to step 1. You'll rinse and repeat. You'll contract the muscle. You move your fingers a little further down, put pressure on the muscle. You'll stretch the muscle under the pressure and release the pressure. And let me show you what that's going to look like. We're going to begin with the flexors. Now, if you remember, the flexors bring the hand in. So, shorten position on the muscle, stretch, and release. It's that simple. Shorten position, move down, stretch, release. Bring the muscle into a shortened position, stretch, release. I'm coming off the muscle now onto the tendons. And I like to work the tendons all the way down and then back again up towards the muscle. So it's that fast. Pressure, stretch, and release. It's a very simple exercise to do, if you can even call it an exercise. It's more of a self-massage, really. You can do it while sitting in the car. You can do it in the checkout line at the store. And it only takes a couple minutes a day. Very easy to do. Now we're going to flip around. We talked that the opposite of the flexors are the extensors. So we're going to take the arm, we're going to flip it over, we're going to bring the hands up to shorten position, pressure, stretch. And this is going to burn on most people. If you notice, I'm going to come off the muscles here. I'm onto the tendons, the stretch, and stretch. And you kind of want to do it about this fast, maybe even faster. I'm sort of slowing it down so that I can, demonstrate what I'm doing here. But working on the extensors is very important. If you're going to work the flexors, work the extensors as well. It's the same technique, soft tissue release. I would prefer somebody doing this maybe 1 to 2 minutes, like 5 times a day, instead of 10 minutes all at once. Okay, you'll get a little bit further if you take small doses of it throughout the day. You'll notice results a lot quicker than if you sit there and, for half an hour I got to do this, because you're not going to do it anyway. But when you're sitting at a red light, when you're waiting for a computer page to load, like whatever it is that holds you up for a couple minutes, take a second and do soft tissue release on the flexors and the extensors. And while you're at it, you can do soft tissue release on the thumb. And we're going to throw in a little cross fiber friction on the ligament. Pressure, stretch, release. Pressure, stretch, release. You get the idea? I hope I'm starting to sound like a broken record here because it's all the same technique. Pressure, stretch, release. Pressure, stretch, release. And you want to do this on both sides. Do it on the thumb. Do it on the, on both thumbs, back and forth. Now let's go to that transverse carpal ligament. Here I'm going to hook on one edge and kind of scrape in one direction or pull. Okay, kind of like a file only cuts in one direction. It may look like I'm rubbing it back and forth, but I'm really kind of grabbing it and pulling it under my thumb, sort of like you'd be plucking a guitar string. Okay, and then do a little self-massage in there. Keep that ligament loose. Pressure, stretch, release. I'm doing the same soft tissue release there, actually on the ligament. Okay, pressure, stretch, release. Pressure, stretch, release. That's right on the transverse carpal ligament. That's the area you want to guard. You want to keep it loose. You want to keep it supple. You want to keep that whole area, the thumb muscles coming down. We don't want any trigger points in there. It's going to affect the carpal tunnel. The flexors and the extensors, we don't want any trigger points building up there because it's going to show up down at the carpal tunnel. So now let's go to the fourth area. And the fourth area we said was up in the neck at the thoracic outlet. So let's see what we can do for the scalene muscles. Look familiar? Pressure, stretch, and release coming back. Pressure, stretch, and release coming back. Going to take it all the way down to the rib and a little bit below if you can. It'll be a little uncomfortable. But believe me, after you've done this a couple times, you'll start to notice some improvement in the range of motion in your neck. This is also very good for people that suffer dizziness, like vertigo. A lot of times the scalenes are involved, but that's another talk. The other side, pressure, stretch, and release. Always remember to release the pressure before you bring the muscle back into a shortened position. Then work back up. Pressure, stretch, and release. You can do that a couple times on each side. I'm just showing you like one shot through. All right, well, that's soft tissue release on those 4 key areas. Now let's look at maybe some stretching that we can do on the flexors and the extensors. This is a nice, easy one that can be done. You're going to put the palms together, keep the fingers together, and try to bring the wrists up 90 degrees, the forearms 90 degrees. What that'll do is stretch out the flexor muscles, which are on the bottom of the arm there. You want to do this very slowly. Never do a stretch quickly. You never want to take it to where it's burning. If you take a stretch to the burn, you're basically tearing and working against yourself. You might think you're getting something done because it's burning, but that burning means you're injuring yourself. Now we're going to do the opposite, and we're going to get the extensors. This is a lot harder on most people. In fact, even on myself, as I'm watching myself do this, I'm realizing that as I come up, my wrists want to separate. So really what I should have done was stopped prior to that and kept my wrists together. Okay, there's nothing to be gained by taking a stretch too far. So if coming up halfway is as far as you can go, that's good. Just go there and then hang on to it for a little bit, 15 or 20 seconds. Maybe kind of do inverse back and forth, one at a time. Do the flexors and then reach around and do the extensors. Again, I'd rather see you do this maybe a minute or two several times a day than a big long 15 or 20 minute session all at once, because that's not how the body responds. If you force the body to do something, it's just going to fight back. But if you give it the right conditions, it will adapt and will grow into what it is you're asking of it. All right, let's talk about stretching the scalene muscles. This is a very simple stretch to do, but we're going to do it in 3 positions. Let's see, we'll start here. I'm going to take a deep breath in and breathe out while I'm looking over my shoulder. Then breath in back to center and breathe out while I'm looking over the shoulder. The breath work's important, so pay attention. There's another something happening here that you can't see, and that is when I look over my right shoulder and I go as far as I can, I let my eyes keep going. And then I breathe in, I breathe out, I look over my left shoulder, and I let my eyes go further than my head will allow. So in other words, you want your eyes to be trying to look far behind you. And what that does is it accesses different muscle groups inside the skull. So it's a very simple stretch, as you can see, breathing in, breathing out, and turning your head. Not much to it. Okay, well now let's move on to the second position. In the second position, we're going to place our hands behind our back as high up towards the kidneys as you can, and we're going to do the exact same movement. Okay, we're going to take a nice deep breath in and out as we go out away from the center. Breath in and breath out, and I'm going to let the eyes keep moving as far back as I can. Breath in and breath out. And let the eyes keep moving. The reason we put the hands behind the back here instead of by our sides is because we're isolating a different set of the scalene muscles. Remember, there's 3 of them, anterior, posterior, and medial. So we're isolating a different set of the scalenes every time we change our hand position, which brings us up to our third position. We're going to bring the arms around front, kind of like you're holding a book open, and do the same stretch again. Breath in back to center, breath out as you go to the side. If you notice, I breathe in through my nose and out through my mouth. That's how Dr. Sun taught us to do it, but it doesn't really matter probably in the end. It's just how I do it. So the important thing here is to realize that the slower you do this, the more benefit you get out of it. And you may start off hearing and feeling crackling and popping in the back of your neck. You'll notice that if you're consistent with this stretch, after about a week or 2, a lot of that's going to start to go away. And you will experience increased range of motion. It's important to keep the shoulders straight so you're not cheating. But they're the stretches that you can do on the scalene muscles. That's actually, I'm borrowing from a Qigong routine called the 8 Pieces of Brocade. All right, well, I want to thank you for watching this. Once again, for Posturing for Health, I'm Bill, and if this was of benefit to you in any way, if this helped you or answered some questions, drop us a line, let us know. If you have any questions, same thing, get in touch with us. If you want, you can continue to explore posturingforhealth.com and see what we're about and what we offer. And I just want to remind you that carpal tunnel syndrome, like many other disease states, sometimes the problem is not always where it shows up. So if you know where to look and what you're looking for, you can avoid a tremendous amount of heartache, surgery, and pharmaceuticals. My motto is situation desperate, not hopeless. And on that note, I will bid you a fond adieu. Have a great day.